Hello, welcome back to this video tutorial series on the ARP 2600V by Arturia, and this is part 2 of our introduction to the sequencer. Please go back and watch part 1 if you've not already seen it. That gives us a good introduction to the sequencer and allows us to press a key on the keyboard and have it play a sequence, and press another key on the keyboard and have it play a different sequence, or the same sequence, a different octave. That's a really important foundation upon which we're going to build all of the more complex or intricate stuff we're going to talk about today. So let's just get straight into it. First things first is that everything that we've done up until now has been on bus 2. What does that mean? Well, every sequencer step is capable of generating its signal on one of 3 different buses. It can't output to 2 at the same time. It's always a bus. Each step outputs to a bus, and at the moment they're all output to bus 2. Let's change these 3 steps so that they're outputting to bus 1 instead. What does that do? Absolutely nothing. Still exactly the same sequence. But bus 1 is different. It's normaled into the clock frequency modulation jack over here. What that means is that at the moment this slider is set to no modulation. If I set it to ×2, frequency ×2, now every time a bus 1 step fires, it's going to play twice as quickly. Okay. That allows us to create some really interesting rhythmic effects. In addition to being able to vary the speed at which each of these steps fire, bus 1 also has a couple of other peculiarities to it. Let's deal with clocked gate 1 out. What's this all about? Well, the clock has a few effects. It controls the overall speed of the sequence. As we've just seen, we can independently control or independently modulate the speed of all the bus 1 gates with this slider here. We'll come back to that shortly. And we also saw in the first part of this tutorial how we can affect the width of each of the gates, how long they're open. So all of that is affected by the clock. If we take a clocked gate 1 out instead of the regular clock out fires every single step. If we take a clocked gate 1 out instead, now only the step 1 gates will cause an output at this jack here. So only the bus 1 gates are causing the filter envelope to trigger. Well, causing the envelope to trigger, which is in turn plugged into the VCF. Now that's very similar to another jack that we've got over here, which is gate bus 1. The difference is that because this is clocked, it's affected by the pulse width setting. So if we set this very low, now when the step 1 gates fire, they fire very, very briefly. If I set this to max, now the envelope is open for as long as possible. If I switch to gate bus 1, it's always open for the full length of time that that gate is open. So gate bus 1 is essentially the same as clocked gate 1 out when the pulse width is set to the maximum, but at any other setting, clocked gate 1 out is having its pulse width controlled as well, as opposed to okay. So that's all the stuff peculiar to bus 1. Bus 2 is not peculiar in any respect. It has no idiosyncrasies. Nothing unusual about it. That's why when we did the whole of part 1, everything was set to bus 2, because it's just your normal position. Bus 3 does have some peculiarities, so let's deal with them. I'll set this 5th step down to bus 3, and you'll see when we hover over it, it's got reset skip function. That's accessed by this little button down here, and at the moment it's off, so it doesn't have any effect. Let's send our filter back to firing all the time, shall we? Okay, so bus 3 is just the same as bus 2 at the moment. If I flick this switch to up, now it's going to jump over this step completely. Watch the lights. Okay, it didn't fire step 5. If I move the button down to reset, it's going to play 4 and then go back to 1. This is going to cause the sequencer to reset. Okay. You may think, in reset mode, is there any point in having multiple sliders set to bus 3? Yes. At the moment, the answer is no. But if I switch to random mode and wait for a little while, eventually, there we go, we hit a 15. In random mode, the sequencer treats each one of these 16 steps as completely independent, and so isn't a linear stepwise sequencer, and so it can jump over steps that would otherwise always cause the sequencer to go back to the beginning. However, you're never going to hear any of the step 3, the bus 3 gates open, because they're all in reset mode. If we turn it to off, now occasionally, if we wait long enough, either a 5 or a 7 is going to fire. There was a 5. Okay. So in off, bus 3 is not unusual in any respect. Let's go back to sequential mode, and we're in our comfortable place again. So we've dealt with clocked gate 1 out and gate bus 1 out. The other 3 jacks that we haven't dealt with in this little section are really straightforward. Gate bus 2 is going to cause the filter to fire exactly and only when bus 2 gates are open. So now this is a handy use of bus 3 to differentiate between bus 2 when it's doing something unusual. And obviously up here, now the filter will only fire at this step, and this one, and this one, and this one. Okay, and the last one, position 1 out, does exactly what it says on the label. It will only fire, it will only generate a signal at this output on the first step of the sequence. And all of the other notes are going to be, they're not going to have that filter envelope firing. Here we come back round, bang, fire. Okay, so that's all of those dealt with. Let's have a little bit more of a look at frequency modulation, because we've seen that bus 1 is normaled into frequency modulation. So when we have this set to double, let's just go back to filtering on every note. But that's only the normal position. If we send a signal into this jack, we'll override that position and bus 1 will no longer be unique. So if we take an output from the LFO, now bus 1 will be treated just the same as bus 2 and 3, but the LFO is going to have an effect on the speed of the sequence. So there's the slow sine wave. We've got a 1 cycle every 4 seconds. The sine wave's going on in the background, and the sequencer is speeding up or slowing down according to where that sine wave is on its cycle. Just makes the effect more excessive, extreme. Take that back out again. Let's set frequency back down to 0 so it doesn't catch us out later, and we're back to a totally normal 16-step sequence. Let's have a look at pulse width. We've already seen that opens the gate for as long as possible. This makes the gate openings very, very small. You can see the clock that this light is lit when the gate is open, so you can see how long the gate is open for visually. But we have a modulation input to control that as well. Just turn that down. So this is a variable control here. Let's just turn it down to 0. So let's choose an input that we're going to use to affect the pulse width. Well, first things first, nice and easy, let's use the LFO. Let's see what that does. Watch the light. Long, long, short, 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 and then gets longer again. But we can get a little bit more fruity than that. See this switch down here? At the moment, this entire sequencer is a 16-step sequencer, and all of those 16 steps are being output at all times to both output A and output B. If I take this out of here instead, it's exactly the same sequence. So A and B are both outputting all 16 steps. If we go to a 2 mode, we split the sequencer up into 2 8-step sequences, and you see a new light lights up. These 2 sequences, completely independent, will now remain in sync. So every time they step on, they'll both step on at the same time. Now what you're hearing here is these 8 notes, because at the moment output B is plugged in. If I go back to A, we're now playing these 8 notes. But I was talking about getting fruity with the pulse width modulation. This was an essential prerequisite. Now I'm going to take output B and plug it into here. So what's this going to do? So there's a concept at play here that I've talked about multiple times whenever talking about modular synthesis. Everything is control voltages. When we think of things in terms of notes and pitches and frequencies, that's a little bit misleading, because at the end of the day, it's all just control voltages being translated into pitches or frequencies or pulse widths or whatever. And these sequencers are just generating control voltages. Now, as things stand at the moment, the first 8 notes are being output to something that generates tone. The VCO chucks tones out at us and we hear them. But we've now said that these 8 control voltages over here, we're no longer talking about them as pitches, are having a modulation effect on the pulse width of the sequencer gates. So let's hear what this is going to sound like. Let's make it really extreme. So when these 4 steps here are firing, the gate is open for a long period of time, and therefore we hear lots of the tone. And when these 4 steps down here fire, long, long, and then it switches to very brief mode. So this is an example of the sequencer steps having a modulation effect rather than a tonal effect, and that we're using B to affect the pulse width, the width of the envelope that's being applied to the filter that's colouring the tone coming out of sequencer A. That's quite a long sentence. Let's go back to listening to this tone again just for a moment. These sequencer outputs down here have a more extreme modulation slope than the quantized outputs. Not only do the quantized outputs round these effects down to whole semitones, so that anything coming out of those quantized outputs is always going to have a control voltage effect that operates on a plus or 2 octave level, go up to 24 semitones, down to minus 24. But at the end of the day, it's just control voltage. The sequencer outputs have a more extreme modulation effect. So let's find out how much more extreme. We go back to A and set this to 0. And that to 12. The first 2 notes are an octave apart, exactly as we'd expect. If we go to sequencer output, how far apart are they? Two octaves. So the slope is double coming out of the sequencer output jacks than it is coming out of the quantized output jacks. Now that's only the default position. We can actually override the control voltage slope that's being applied to it. I'm going to play a C4 and we're going to get this sequence. I take a jack out of this keyboard CV out times 4 into here and play the same note, get exactly the same sequence. Take it back out again temporarily. I'm going to play an octave lower. Plug the cable back in. It's multiplied all of those control voltages by 4. So that lowest note that you're hearing now is 4 octaves lower. It's actually 3 octaves lower than the note I'm playing, because the note I'm playing is already 1 octave lower than the center point of the control voltage key follow. Okay, so imagine you've got a center point, a seesaw axis, around which everything is based, and it's C4. So if you plug that X4 in, it has no effect because the incoming control voltage is the same in both cases. It's 0. But basically by tipping this slope, the incoming signal that we send in now when we play a C3 is the equivalent of 4 octaves below that center point rather than 1. And if I play a note 2 octaves lower, it's inaudible. We're into low frequency mode and none of those notes are actually audible because we've gone 2 octaves lower on the keyboard, which is 16 octaves lower if you're multiplying all of your control voltages by 4. So this CV input over here allows you to do some pretty funky things. If we take an LFO into it, now the LFO is having its gently curving, sometimes extreme, sometimes nothing effect on the control voltage input of all of those notes that are being played. Nearly done on the home stretch now. Let's go back to 16.1 mode. Pretty sick of this sequence by now. So instead of holding the key down and having the sequence play and then letting the key go and having the sequence stop, I can go into trigger mode. Now, when I play a key on the keyboard, the sequence starts. The next time I play a key on the keyboard, it's gone to 16 mode, hasn't it? It'll stop. And then the next time it'll start, and the next time it'll stop. So it's now accepting a trigger signal, basically pushing that button and latching it down until it receives another signal to tell it to stop. If we go back to gate mode, and instead of plugging into start stop, just plug into start, now when we play a key on the keyboard, the sequencer will start, but it's received no stop command. So now you're going to need to find another source from somewhere in order to generate a stop command. The stop command can in turn, whatever that comes from, be plugged in here. So now when I press a key on the keyboard, it's going to stop the sequencer. Let's put the gate back to start stop, so we're in regular mode again. Instead of going to reset, let's go to step. So now every time we hold key down on the keyboard, the sequencer moves on until I let go, and then it stops, and then it restarts again. If you have any shred of sanity left at this point, congratulations, achievement unlocked. I'm now in desperate need of a cup of tea and sit down in a dark room, and I'll see you for the next episode. Hope to see you then. Thanks very much for watching.